رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you so much for being here. I see some familiar faces from last year. It's a pleasure, and some new faces as well. Our time is very limited, as it always is, so I'm going to just let you know that I'm going to be talking very, very fast. And you might get frustrated at points, like, what did she say? Can you repeat that, etc. I will be in the speaker's corner at 1:30 for an hour. So just come by, we can talk, I can answer some more questions, anything we don't get to, inshallah. Okay, so we're going to come back to the questions you answered in this survey. And during the session, right on the website that you're at, if you click on the Q&A button up at the top left, you can submit questions at any point during this session. And I'm going to try to answer as many of them as possible towards the end. If somebody submits a question that you like and you also want me to answer, you can vote on that question, and that'll let me know that that's a popular question that we should try to address. Questions so far? Okay. So here's our session agenda. This is a huge topic to the point where literally I'm writing a book on this right now, and inshallah it will be out in early next year. What we're going to do in this session is only focus on these four things right here. So we're going to answer the first most obvious thing, which is hijab obligatory or fard? And the fact that we even have to address this at this point in time tells us how far away from our deen we have gotten. We're also going to talk about the topic of the session itself, which is, well, if it's fard, why is it so difficult for us today to adopt and maintain the hijab in its rightful form? Then we're going to talk about the ideological forces that are working against us, making it so challenging, especially for young sisters, to adopt and maintain the hijab. And lastly, where do we go from here? Sounds good? Okay, I'm going to need you to engage. I'm an English teacher, so I'm not used to just giving lectures. I'm used to engaging. So I need you to stay alert. I need you to stay with it. If the talk is going in a direction that is not helpful, I need you to let me know. Capiche? Yes. All right, here we go. Is the hijab obligatory? Raise your hand if you say yes. Raise your hand if you say no. Raise your hand if you're not sure. Okay, so this is going to go in one ear and out the other, not because you don't find it interesting or important, but because you know this. So why are you here? Why are you sitting in on a session like this? Not a rhetorical question. Why are you here? Yes? So you can advise others. So how many of you have sisters in your lives who are struggling with the hijab? Yeah. I struggled with hijab. And for those of you who are not familiar with my background, I was an atheist for 10 years, which means I didn't wear hijab at all. I started wearing hijab about 2 years ago after I reverted. And it was right after Ramadan. So I can understand, where a lot of our fellow sisters are coming from who are struggling with the hijab. So, the fard of hijab. There are at least 7 different places in the Quran where the topic of the hijab is covered. It may not be identified as hijab or khimar, but it's spoken about as a barrier and as a protective safeguard in our deen. There is a consensus among classical scholars of Islam since the time of the Prophet up until now that the hijab is fard. Okay, there's ijma' on this. The fact that our society today is starting to question this is something very interesting and very new, and it should raise red flags for you, because you should think to yourself, well, how come for 1400 years none of these classical scholars doubted that this was a requirement in Islam? Why is it now all of a sudden something that is ambiguous to us? That should raise a red flag. Here are some ayahs from the Quran, Surah Al-Ahzab, regarding not merely the Prophet's wives and daughters, but all the women of Islam, of the Ummah, are required to wear the hijab. Okay, so we're not going to spend any more time on this. I know, again, that I'm preaching to the choir. There are far more qualified scholars at the conference here who can elaborate on this if you're still not sure about this, and I want to encourage you to reach out to them. Sheikh Muhammad al-Shanawi is a wonderful resource, so you can go to him. Okay, so why are we struggling, right? Here's the interesting part, and I want to now go to the survey. I asked you, when you think of hijab, what words come to mind? The number one word that came up, modesty. And I'm going in order of popularity. This is what you guys said. Modesty, protection, faith, respect, misconception, obligation, and then the rest are sort of like less popular words. Hijab, journey, pressure, piety, queen, high, Islam, shame, honor. Okay? So generally speaking, positively charged words, not negative. So in here, we have a generally positive attitude towards the hijab, alhamdulillah. We know a lot of sisters don't have that sentiment. And it's not an accident that the people who need to hear this message the most are the ones who are not here in the audience, right? And I don't say that in a judgmental way. I'm not saying that in the sense that I'm trying to point fingers at fellow sisters who are struggling and saying, why aren't they here? Shame on them. No, it is symptomatic of what we're going to talk about today, that they are not here. And again, I was one of those sisters. I would never come to an Islamic conference when I was struggling with my deen. Why would I go there? I don't want to hear those things. And human nature is such that when we are struggling with something, when we don't want to hear something that we know will force us to do something we don't want to do, we don't want to hear it. Right? When your parents tell you to eat your vegetables or wear your hijab a certain way, you don't want to hear it. Not because you don't think it's right, but because our nafs gets in the way. And that's something that we all experience. Okay, I asked, how many of you watch Muslim beauty bloggers and YouTubers? 57% said sometimes, 33% said never. I'm gonna guess those are the moms. 10% said almost daily. And then when I asked, why do you or don't you wear the hijab? Here are some of the answers. I'm wearing hijab because I want to please Allah and enter Jannah. I started wearing hijab just because it was expected of me once I turned 12. Now hijab is something I'm used to. I feel safe. It's more modest. I wear hijab because Allah commands me to, and it makes me feel empowered. I don't want to go to hell. Because we're commanded to wear it by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I do it because it's a form of ibadah. I do it because the Quran says so. I do it because it's an order from Allah. I do it because I'm proud of my religion. I do it because it's mandatory. So, mashallah, that is a blessing from Allah. Because there's clarity there, and most, I would say, millennials and centennials in our Muslim diaspora, they can't say what you just said. Okay? They can't articulate that. So, what we're going to be focusing on now are the struggles, and what the audience that I'm particularly talking about is my generation, millennials. And centennials, the generation that came after mine. So basically anybody born after 1980. And the reason I'm focusing on this demographic is because this is the group that they're the two youngest generations in the United States, Canada, the West in general. They're the ones who, by and large, of course there are exceptions, but who by and large were born and or raised in Western nations. Okay? They're the ones who, by and large, are disconnected from, or not as connected to the Quran and the Sunnah and the Arabic language. Sounds okay? Okay. So, to give you an anecdote to kick off the next part. Who is this?
She's a model.
She's a model? Yeah. It's Noor Taguri. She's a Libyan American journalist. And in 2016, when I was podcasting for my podcast, she came out as being celebrated as the first, quote, hijabi Muslim to be featured in Playboy magazine. And this was one of the photos in the magazine. Now, obviously, we know that Playboy is known for its provocative and sexual content. So the fact that a hijabi, a Muslim sister, a woman of a faith that prizes itself on modesty, would appear in such a publication is jarring, to say the least, right? But non-Muslim audiences celebrated this as an example of a minority group breaking into the mainstream, that this is something to celebrate. Muslims should have the same sort of representation and visibility in mainstream culture like any other group. Do you remember this? Does this sound familiar? I'm sure you can think of other examples, right? For us as Muslims, this left our community very divided, and I podcasted about this. And the thing that I wanted to focus on at the time was her argument that her being featured in Playboy was a personal choice. How many of you think that that argument is sound? That her making this decision, whether or not you agree with it, you can disagree with it, but it's still a personal choice. Raise your hand if you think that that's true. I want you to look around the room. Keep your hands up, guys. Look around the room. Okay, now, if you think it's not a personal choice, raise your hand. Look around the room. What do you notice? I'll tell you what I noticed. And you're sitting up here too, so you can tell me if I'm wrong. The majority of you who said it's a personal choice happen to be millennials and centennials, younger ladies. The majority of you who said it's not a personal choice, you seem a little bit older. That's not a bad thing. No, I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm making a generational distinction because the topic itself is wound up. It's inextricably tied with the millennial and centennial Muslims in the West. You were brought up to imbibe, to absorb, to soak in certain ideas about personal autonomy, about personal choice, about freedom, and what those things mean. The older generation, or slightly older generations, especially if they were not brought up in the West, it's not that they don't know what these words mean. They have a different worldview of what these terms mean. Now, one of the arguments that I made about this is, this can't be a personal choice because it's a public platform. Right? You're doing this in the public, so how is it a personal choice? Furthermore, Nur Tagore argues that she is representing Muslims. She has said this. She says, I'm the voice of Muslim sisters. I will not misrepresent you in the media. How many of you feel like she represented you well by doing this? Now, I'm going to pause here and I'm going to share a caveat, which I do share in my book. The only reason, actually there are two reasons, the only reasons why I have decided, and I thought long and hard about this, the only reasons why I've decided to point out specific individuals is because, number one, it is obligatory. We are commanded by Allah to enjoin good and forbid evil. That's why we're having this conversation. We're not engaging in public criticism of fellow Muslims for the sake of criticizing people. That's un-Islamic, right? The other reason is, these choices, these public acts, have far-reaching consequences for us as an ummah. What happens in the private sphere, and particularly what happens within someone's nafs, is none of my business. It's not your business either, it's Allah's, right? But the things we do in the public are public choices, and especially when they have long-term implications for us as an ummah, we need to step up, and we need to do things the right way. We need to speak up with adab and according to the lived example of our Prophet. Does that make sense? Anybody disagree? Remember, you can post comments privately if you want to have more conversation about that. So I wanted to clarify that. I don't want anybody walking out here thinking it's okay to start bashing other Muslims, you know, pointing at them, laughing at them. That's not what we're doing here. Okay? And I don't know Nur Tagore personally. I'm sure she's a wonderful human being, and I make dua for her, and I hope that she'll make dua for me, because nobody is infallible. So, the next part is, or to continue this section, why are we struggling? We want to be included in mainstream society. That's why I shared the example of Nur Tagore. We want so desperately to be a part of the American fabric, millennials and centennials in particular. And over the last decade, there has been a rise in this hijabi subculture, which I'm going to talk about. It's a subculture that is very much preoccupied with representation and inclusion. And that to me translates as self-consciousness. That we are very self-conscious about our Muslimness. And I'm not going to say Muslim identity, because that word identity now belongs to a particular framework that we don't want to get stuck in. Islam is not an identity the way that being black or Arab or Asian or whatever, okay? That's not what it is. And we have to stop calling it that. So here are some examples of hijabi subculture. It's a political, it's a social, it's a fashion trend. Okay, it's anything but a religious obligation. More and more the hijab is being taken away from its religious foundation and its religious roots, and it's being refashioned, no pun intended, to serve as a political statement. So sisters like Noor Taguri, Amani Khattab, and some of the hijabi YouTubers, when interviewed by public platforms and are asked, why do you wear the hijab? We're constantly hearing sound bites like, it empowers me, or because I wanted to clap back at Islamophobia, or after 9/11, I felt like I needed to defend my religion. Those things are not inherently wrong, okay? I'm not saying that those motivations are inherently wrong, but what's problematic there is that's not what the Quran tells us is the purpose of the hijab in the first place. That's not why Allah has ordained it for us. And once that safety issue is gone, once the fashion trends change, if those were your reasons for wearing hijab, what do you have left then? Why are you still wearing it? If it's not a fashion trend, if it's not because you're trying to make a political statement, then what sustains you? Here is an article from NPR. It's entitled, America's Next Generation of Muslims Insists on Crafting Its Own Story. Look at the language, ladies. Look at how the language and the narrative about hijab is being changed. It's changing over the last 10 years. That it is the individual, it is about personal autonomy. It is up to you as an empowered woman to define what hijab means to you. How many of you have heard that? The hijab means X to me. Right? What is that saying? That is basically saying that you don't wear hijab because God told you to. You wear hijab for personal reasons, for personal choices. How many of us have heard hijab is a personal choice? How many of you have heard hijab is personal expression? Where does that phrase personal expression come from? Where have you heard it before you heard it being associated with the hijab? Sexuality and fashion. I wear a fedora because that's how I express myself, right? Okay. The second reason why we're struggling to wear the hijab is because we have internalized colonial and orientalist ideas of the hijab as oppressive, misogynistic, and patriarchal, okay? And for, I think, young sisters, not all of course, but for many, the thing that I have often heard is, you know, my mom, all she is a stay-at-home mom, and, you know, she's frumpy, and the hijab itself is frumpy and woo-woo, and, you know, that it's this, like, ugly thing, and it's associated with mommies and aunties and grandparents who are not fashion-forward, right? But a lot of this is inherited thinking. It comes from a long-standing history of the West looking at Islam and looking at Muslim women. And we ourselves are internalizing those images and those ideas about our own religion, about our own women. And that creates more self-consciousness. So then we start hearing more of this language to combat that self-consciousness. Hijab doesn't oppress me, it empowers me. Who are you talking to, sister? Who are you responding to? Anybody know? When we say things like this, who's our audience? Not Muslims, right? Not Muslims. People who don't understand Islam, people who have misconceptions about Islam. And again, nothing I'm saying here is all or nothing. I'm not saying that we should not do this, that this is inherently wrong. I'm saying we should not be so arrested by this subconsciousness of how others perceive us that we have completely lost sight of our own religious motivations. Another reason is we have internalized liberal values about tradition versus modernity. And I'm going to talk about this as well, but just keep this in the back of your mind. And then lastly, we have internalized Western definitions of female beauty, and it ain't Islam. Your hair has to flow, your clothes have to hug your curves, makeup is important, the more the better. Basically this very sexualized version of female beauty is what counts as self-worth and what counts as valuable to the non-Muslim gaze. And we struggle with that, especially the younger ones, right? I mean, again, I'm not saying this pointing fingers. I didn't wear hijab for most of my life. I've only been wearing hijab for 2 years. I worked in New York on the Upper West Side. I was an assistant principal. I wore what most, businesswomen wear. Okay, so I get it. I get the desire to, be presentable, to get attention from men and women, right? To just feel like you're being looked at. But that's a disease of the heart. Okay, that's part of our nafs. That's one of the sacrifices we have to make in the dunya, so that there is a greater reward in the akhirah. Okay, so we understand that hijab is fard, but what constitutes as hijab? More and more this keeps coming up, and it's remarkable because sometimes I just want to be like, really? You don't know that a bodycon dress is not hijab? You know I know you know that I know you know that this ain't hijab. And you know I know that showing your bangs is not hijab. But let's go through an exercise. I'm gonna put some images of fashion bloggers, popular fashion bloggers, and you're gonna tell me, is this hijab or not? Is this hijab? Why not? Tight. More skin is showing, hair is showing, the aura is clearly, on display. Okay, so you know this. How about this? Well, hold on, she's wearing a scarf. Okay, so again, the tight, right? How about this? Why isn't this an example of hijab, according to the Quran and the Sunnah? Okay, this one's a little bit of a trick question. The guy? What about the guy? Yeah. So, ladies, hijab is not just a scarf. It's not just what you cover. It is a lifestyle. It is behavior. It is the way you carry yourself as well. Modesty in its entire essence. Okay? The way we speak, the way we walk, the way we interact with the opposite gender, that is also a part of the hijab. Okay? We have to remember that. Now, I'm not saying you're going to go to sisters who dress like this and say, that's not hijab, you might as well take it off. Don't do that. Wrong. Don't do that. And I will be the first to admit, when I decided to start wearing the hijab, the first thing I did was learn how to tie it turban style. I did it for a day and then I was like, Noor, you know I know you know that this is not hijab. And I had to literally look in the mirror and say, come on, you've committed to this faith, you believe it's the truth. Allah knows what's in your heart. And you're not wearing this for the right reasons right now, so you need to check yourself. And I did. And it was hard. And I was embarrassed. But life went on. Alhamdulillah. So don't go up to sisters who are struggling with hijab. You don't know where they are in their journey. Okay? You don't know where they are in their journey. Be empathetic. Okay. So now, part 3, ideological forces. What does ideology mean? Belief, worldview, framework, okay? When we say worldview, ideology, framework, this is literally what it means. The ideas, the values, the language, the culture, everything within that worldview exists to support that view. So think about words. Words like freedom and equality. Those words within an Islamic worldview have one definition. Those words in a liberal worldview have a different definition. So equality in Islam looks very different between men and women. And in the liberal worldview, equality between men and women looks another way. That's why so many sisters are struggling with feminism. The hijab is oppressive because freedom means X, Y, and Z. But hold up, whose freedom are you talking about? See, we have to start at the definition level. We have to start at the level of language. And that's a different topic, but I just want to put that in your ear really quickly. Do not take words for granted. Start with definitions. Classical Islamic scholars would begin their debates and their arguments first by saying, let's clarify terms. Let's make sure we're on the same page about what we're talking about here. Because otherwise we're gonna get into an argument, a line of argumentation, and we're gonna talk past each other only to realize, oh, you had a different definition of equality to begin with. That's not what I understood equality to mean, okay? So, let's talk about the ideologies that are working against us to make us struggle with the hijab. Okay, this is dense. I suggest you take a picture of it. You're gonna want this later on, so take a picture of it. Ah! Okay. How many of you have heard these words before? Maybe in your college classes, your high school classes, maybe on YouTube, maybe in conferences. Yeah, okay. I'm not gonna sit here and teach you what these words are. All I'm gonna say is this. Because you have the definitions now. All I'm gonna say is this. These are all worldviews that are in competition with Islam. Okay, these are all worldviews that are in competition with Islam. And they have their own sets of values and things that they defend. And oftentimes those values and the things that they defend contradict the Quran. Okay? You cannot exist as a human being and be at peace with yourself when you are adopting conflicting worldviews. This leads to something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is an experience we go through when we feel torn on the inside. On the one hand, I'm a Muslim, but on the other hand, I don't believe that the Quran actually says you have to wear hijab. I'm a Muslim, I think, but I don't believe that being gay is a sin. I'm a Muslim, and I don't believe that riba is really that bad. All those things come from different worldviews, and when you adopt both, you end up struggling internally. Does that make sense? Okay, so as young sisters, many of us are struggling with the hijab because of this cognitive dissonance. Because on the one hand, we want to fit into a society that historically and to the present day is antagonistic of Islam. But on the other hand, Islam is so much a part of who we are and how we were brought up. And more than that, it is what we believe is the truth. So there's that chasm, that being torn. And I'm going to bring up this word again towards the end because there's a particular, probably the most popular fashion blogger who removed her hijab and posted a video and talks about this chasm. So we'll take a look at that. Okay, so I've identified the most important parts of these worldviews to explain to you in red what you need to pay attention to. Here's what you need to take away from this slide. Now, I'm not talking about extreme situations where there's coercion and abuse. That's wrong in and of itself for obvious reasons. Your parents force you to go to school, don't they? Your parents force you to eat right, don't they? How come those things are acceptable, but when your parents instruct you to wear hijab, it's considered oppressive? Do you see where I'm going with this? But the younger generation has a hard time understanding this because you were born into a worldview, a framework here in the West where personal autonomy is put on a pedestal. You choose how to live your life. And if you don't, then you're oppressed. That is a false, false, false premise that many of us are operating under. Okay. Here is a quote from Sister Buthayna Hamda's master's thesis, which I highly recommend you read. It's on my website, you can also Google it. It's about the liberalization of the hijab. She says, there's an emerging narrative, primarily within the media, but also within other channels, to revise both the definition of and motivations behind wearing the hijab. Can somebody paraphrase this for us? What is she saying? You knew I was going to ask you that. I'm an English teacher. Put it in your own words. And I'm asking you to put it in your own words because this is a key takeaway. Yes?
People aren't praying to the Quran anymore, but to what?
Can you speak up a little bit more?
People aren't praying to the Quran for their answers anymore, but whatever fits their agreement with it.
Uh-huh. You've got the first part. Perfect. What are we turning to if not the Quran? Just went over it.
Mainstream. First one's not.
What are these things?
Ideology.
Ideologies. We're turning to secularism, liberalism, modernity, and postmodernity to talk about the hijab. And that's a problem. Why? Because as I said from before, every framework has its definition of words. Those words are designed to defend that framework. So if you use those words to try and defend your framework, what's going to happen? You're going to lose. Those words don't serve your framework. How many of you find that sometimes when you talk about things related to Islam, you're saying it and you hear how it's coming across as so bad to somebody who's a non-Muslim? Because you're using their words. Those words are laden. They are enveloped. They have been co-opted. They belong to a long history of ideas and values. You get what I'm saying? So that's why it's not worth trying to pander to those misconceptions. Spend time learning the Quran, reading the Seerah of the Prophet, learn your religion. There's more bang for your buck there. Okay, let's keep going. So, how many of you know Dina Turkiya? Okay. Sweet sister, super sweet sister, very charismatic, very effective at what she does. She was one of the first pioneers of the modest fashion industry. She's based out in the UK. She's half English, half Egyptian. She's been wearing the hijab since she was 11 or 12. She took it off last year. And it came as a shock to many. Many also said, well, I saw it coming because she was wearing hijab traditionally, then the turban, then her bangs started to show, then this and that. And we see that progression with a lot of sisters. And I don't know about you, but when I see that, I'm like, oh, they're struggling with their nafs, you know? Like they're struggling with everything we've been talking about. Okay, so here's what she said recently. She said, modest fashion is open to interpretation from whoever chooses to define their dress sense with the term. Take out the word modest fashion and replace it with hijab. Now read it to yourself. What do you think? No? Why no?
Basically, if you replace the word, it just, anybody can define it to mean anything.
But isn't that what we're saying?
Good or bad.
Ah, good or bad. Okay. So we're opening the door more and more, and that's what Buthayna Hamda was saying here. That's what she's saying. We're pushing the envelope on what hijab means, its actual purpose, as well as what defines hijab in terms of appearances. Yes?
And maybe that was why she used the term modest fashion, because she did want to interpret, she realized her audience wasn't just Muslim.
That's a great point to bring up. So actually in a video, she does use the word hijab. She equates it with hijab. And also I want to say, after having done research for 2 years on this topic, we're saying modest fashion, but you know how I keep saying language belongs to a framework? Modest fashion belongs to a Western framework. It is in large part, it is a Western-driven industry. that has a lot of affiliations with non-Western countries, right? Like in the UAE and in the Gulf and such. But it's kind of a PR disaster to use the word hijab as opposed to modest fashion, right? How can you sell that kind of attire, which caters to Muslim and non-Muslim women, if you're using hijab? You get what I'm saying? So it's just a reworking of words to make it more palatable for consumers. But what's ending up happening is we're taking this word and we as Muslims are saying, let's see how much we can stretch this. Let's see how far we can take this, right? Like the images I showed you of sisters who you said this is not hijab. And you're right, it's not, right? It's not modest. It's not in accordance with the Quran and the Sunnah. That being said, the Quran does give us a very broad margin within which to work, right? Based on culture, based on traditions, based on styles within a certain geographical place. And what is allowed to be shown is pretty clear, right? It's pretty clear what we're allowed and permitted to show in public versus what is not. And loose flowing clothing is one of those things that there's ijma on. There's never been up until this time any question about whether or not skinny jeans are, a sign of modesty. Okay, so Dina Turkiya, the fact that she's saying this now demonstrates that here's somebody who's a public figure who came onto the scene of modest fashion, advocating for hijab. Not necessarily as a political statement, because she says she came onto the scene because she just wanted to express her creativity and do something, for herself. But the thing is, when you sign up to join this subculture, you inevitably, even if you don't mean to, you inevitably, one, become a role model, because you're asking people to look at you, to follow you, to like, to vote, to, pay attention to your social media. So you become a role model. And now your public choices are everybody's business. When young sisters are looking to you as a role model, their moms are going to be concerned. Okay, so let's talk about this industry and this subculture. I go back and forth between modest fashion subculture and hijabi subculture. And the reason is, even though this subculture is sort of led by sisters in the modest fashion world, the subculture, in terms of its way of thinking, in terms of the things that it finds important, in terms of the things that it's obsessed with, it extends itself outside of the modest fashion world and into the activist, social justice warrior, hijabi world. Does that make sense? So, what I need to say there is that when I'm saying hijabi subculture, I'm talking about the modest fashion public figures, the influencers, but activists and politicians and athletes as well, okay? All right, so here's a statistic for you to keep in mind. That's how serious this industry is. It's encouraging exorbitant consumerism, which we know is not condoned by our deen. Right? Our deen is very much about graciousness and charity and giving to others and helping society. But look at how much we're spending on makeup and nail polish and shoe and those sorts of things. Now, nowhere in our deen are we instructed to dress shabbily or to look like we are impoverished or anything like that. We're instructed to be presentable and clean and to carry ourselves with dignity. But that doesn't mean that we need to spend this much money in order to fulfill that. Now, I will say there's good that has come out of this industry. In the last 10 years, the influx of YouTubers has brought on the hijabi tutorial category. How many of you have turned on YouTube and watched a tutorial on how to wear hijab? I had to. I didn't know how to wear hijab when I started wearing hijab, to be honest with you. So there is some good that has come out of it. I think apart from that, it has also given young sisters a sense of pride, like, oh yeah, there's some representation there that's not negative, or entirely immodest. But again, when we're doing things for the wrong reasons, it can be very easy for us to get swept away by shaitan and the lure of the dunya. And what a lot of these sisters end up doing is either removing the hijab or spending way too much time inadvertently, I think it's unintentional, sort of encouraging other sisters to spend, right? And one sister actually comes on constantly like laughing off her bad spending habits. And then we trivialize bad spending habits as if there isn't consequence for that. We have to be very careful about the messages that we're sending. Basically, if you were to ask the experts what is modest fashion, they all say something similar to what Dina Torkia said, that it's open to interpretation, it's up to the individual, and it's a fashion trend. So where in that does Islam fit in? Nowhere. From beginning to end, it has nothing to do with Islam. Okay, it's either about fashion or political statements. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna breeze through a couple of these, and I do wanna talk about this slide because I think it's super important. So here, I'm gonna read an excerpt from my paper. The hijabi subculture serves as a conduit through which the hijab, Muslim women, and Islam are being liberalized and secularized. Buthaina Hamda appropriately argues that liberalism has contributed to a relativist definition of hijab. That is, the liberal worldview within whose sphere Muslims operate has forced a redefinition of the hijab that is devoid of meaning, connected to the divine, and increasingly tied to materialistic and political meanings. However, we as Muslims should not be hasty to blame liberal secularism for warping and bastardizing the meaning and the purpose of the hijab, because as Hamda points out, Muslims themselves have been adopting and internalizing the tenets of liberalism. These specific ideas of autonomy, individualism, and public reason, even with respect to matters of their own faith, which is an unprecedented occurrence among Muslims. All this while seeking inclusion in a pluralistic America. With so many Muslim sisters watching, a culture began forming, one that saw attractive young muhajjabat as leading the way for a version of the hijab that was palatable to the postmodern world. It would be merely a matter of time before this version of the hijab would prove itself less Islamic and more secular. So there is an element of accountability that we have to own, okay? We can't just like point fingers at all these frameworks and say, well, they're the reason why we're struggling. Yes, they're there to test us. And those tests are a promise from God, right? God has said to us, do you think that you will be believers and that we will not test you? Of course we will be tested. And this is one of those tests. So, you know, the game is on and Allah is watching as always, and it's up to us to turn to Him. Now, the reason I wanted to point out Sister Iman al-Khattabi is because she's probably one of the leading millennial activists who started a website called Muslim Girl right around 9/11. She has said that she started wearing the hijab for political reasons. She wanted to rewrite the narrative regarding hijab. And I would say those intentions are noble. There's nothing wrong with that. There was a lot of backlash after 9/11, and there's a lot of negativity about Islam and Muslim women after 9/11. But once again, if that's where your hijab begins and ends, what's going to happen when the times change and people don't feel that way about Islam and Muslims anymore? Are you going to continue wearing your hijab, or are you going to remove it? Take a look at the individuals that, you know, support her work. Anybody know who this gentleman is on the far left? This is Gary Vaynerchuk, multi-billionaire, entrepreneur extraordinaire. People, non-Muslims, like gush to get 1 second with this guy. He's considered like a genius. He now funds Muslim Girl. So there's a lot of money going into this project. You have to stop and ask yourself, what does somebody like Gary Vaynerchuk, what does somebody like Bill Clinton, what does a society like postmodern America have to gain by supporting the content that is produced by Muslim Girl? You have to ask yourself that. And you should be asking yourself that about everything. Anytime certain views and public decisions by Muslims are being advocated for, you have to ask, who's advocating those things? Because they have something at stake. There is something at stake there. And my argument here would be that Muslim Girl pushes a very reformist interpretation of Islam. There are articles like this constantly. Why gay imams are better for Muslim women. Constantly. It's not in line with the Quran and the Sunnah. So you really, really, really need to ask yourself who your role models are, and ask your friends to ask themselves who their role models are. Okay, so I'm gonna skip these slides, but I wanted to give you a sense of, this is Dina Turkiya through her sort of evolution, you know, with the hijab. But she points out a very important question. And she says in her video, when she went out public and said, you know, I removed the hijab, she says, let me get this straight, oh Muslim community. So it's a personal choice to wear hijab when you want to wear it. But when I decide to take it off, it's not a personal choice anymore. And honestly, fair game. Fair game. But it's our fault for allowing ourselves to get to the point where somebody can ask that question as a member of our community and be totally justified in asking that question. And the answer is, it was never a personal choice to begin with. I'm gonna just say it like it is. Hijab is not a personal choice. Allah said we have to wear it. There are valid reasons behind it, and even if there weren't, Allah said so. But we live in a society now where it's unacceptable for you to say, because God said so. Oh, you're so barbaric. Oh, you're such a simpleton. Oh, you still believe in God? So I'll end here with Asya Al-Faraj. Anybody know who she is? Okay. She is based out in Kuwait. She's super, super popular, probably the most popular pioneer of the modest fashion industry. She's been struggling to reconcile her faith for a while now, and she says the following. I'll just read what it says here. And this is from her video where she publicly talks about having removed the hijab. She says, because so much of my online life is spent having everyone believe that they can truly live authentically and really be themselves, I just no longer feel like I represented that well. There was like a fissure, a chasm, of something that I was saying, but nothing that I was doing for myself. And I think that the anxiety stemmed from that, the duality of both of those things, not ever meeting up the way that they should. So basically what she's articulating here is, on the one hand, she was wearing hijab in her videos, but outside of her videos, she had taken it off. She wasn't wearing it anymore, and she felt like she was living a lie, and she didn't want to keep doing that and being deceptive. But furthermore, the real chasm there is that here's somebody who is a Muslim, and I'm going to presume she still identifies as a Muslimah, who believed that wearing the hijab was fard and that it was an obligation, and who no longer believed that, and now has to address her public audience, who she gained precisely because she was a hijabi, you know, a blogger, right? So this has implications for sisters, young sisters, who don't have the wherewithal to understand the world, who don't have the tools and the intellectual capacity to make sense of all this. You look at somebody you admire, they're going through a change, and you think, well, it's just a change. And so down the line, if and when you're confronted with something that is going to shake your iman, you may think back, maybe unconsciously, well, if Asya did it, what's the big deal if I do it? I will say though, the one person who, or let me back up. Sheikh Yasir Qadhi said, to commit a sin is bad. To justify that sin is much worse. Listen, nobody's infallible, and I could sit here for days and rattle on about the dumb things I've done in my life. But I will never justify a single one of those things as being moral or permissible or pleasing to Allah. And the one person who actually took off her hijab and addressed the public and said, I don't actually want you to do what I'm doing. What I'm doing is something I'm struggling with, and I have to face that, is Dina Turkiya. At least there, she said to her young sisters who watch her, she said, please don't look at me as a role model. You know, and at least there's some honesty, and there's a way back from, you know, the unfortunate circumstances of this hijabi subculture. Okay, so I'm gonna end here. I'm sorry if I went over on time. Jazakallahu khairan. May Allah make it easier for all of us, Ya Rab, and may He purify our hearts and give us the resilience and the strength needed to resist the temptations of this dunya. Assalamu alaikum.